Due to the ongoing coronavirus situation, the following program is pre-recorded. This is not a live broadcast.
You're listening to The Ray Carr Show, Tuesdays, 7 to 9 a.m. on WCSB Cleveland.
Hey gang, this is Michael Stanley, and right now, you're right where you should be. Listening to The Ray Carr Show on WCSB Cleveland.
A show is a show, I know, you know. They're broadcasting mono and stereo. My favorite one on the radio, the famous Ray Carr Show. Tuesdays on WCSB, it's 89.3 FM frequency. 7 a.m. to 9 will be the famous Ray Carr Show. DJ's yakety yak, a street commercial radio. But Mr. Ray will always feature quality audio. A show is a show, I know, you know. There's hundreds of them on the radio. Which is the one you want to know? Well, listen to this. It's the Ray Carr Show.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Ray Carr Show. Is an old friend of mine, and he's now written a musical. It's called Infamous, and it's going to be out soon. His name is David Owen Michaels. David, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Ray.
David, it's always a pleasure, and I have the script of this very interesting, I would call it a musical, and there's music, right?
Oh, yeah.
A lot of music.
22 original songs here. It's a 2-act, full-length musical, and it basically is taking Abraham Lincoln's assassination through the perspective of Lincoln's killer, John Wilkes Booth.
How did you come up with that premise?
That's a very good question, Ray. I was at home. I went to Cleveland State. My brother was a student at Lakewood High School. He came home. He said, "What's up, Bill? What are you learning about in school?" The Lincoln assassination. And he told me how boring that subject was in the textbook. I'm like, "Bill, that's fascinating. That's extremely fascinating." So just that whole concept of it occurring in a theater, and from an early age,
right.
My parents nurtured in me my love of theater and music. I just felt like that was the correct medium to tell that story.
Yeah, now there's a lot about it people don't understand. They know that Booth shot Lincoln, jumped from the balcony, and he ran with a broken leg off stage, and I believe Dr. Mudd eventually fixed him up, right?
Right.
And Dr. Mudd was the grandfather of national broadcaster Roger Mudd.
That's correct.
I remember that. But there's a lot that happened before and after. So let's talk about before. John Wilkes Booth was not happy with Lincoln, and he had planned on killing him a long time before this, right?
Well, that's not exactly 100% true. There was a plot initially to kidnap Lincoln. That was the initial plot. Mm-hmm. That plot turned to murder after some events occurred the week of the assassination, when those events are the juicy details that make this musical happen.
Okay. Now, how much research was done in planning this?
Oh, tons. I read tons of books. Of course, what comes to mind, Killing Lincoln, Bill O'Reilly, that book. Manhunt by Swanson, great book. But, I've read countless books on the Civil War and Lincoln just to form this story and make sure that its foundation was correct.
How many people, percentage-wise, were unhappy with Lincoln at that point?
At that point in history, he was actually a very unpopular president. He goes down in history as our beloved president that everybody thinks back to, but at that time, it was very divided in their opinion of Abraham Lincoln.
Did you find in your research that he was a confident man?
I found in my research that he appeared to have strength as an orator, but in his personal life, he actually battled severe depression.
And he had a wife that didn't help things, Mary Todd Lincoln.
Correct.
So she had her own issues.
Right. They grew apart during the war, and the loss of his son during the war. His son, Willie, passed away. That weighed on him more than anything. So it led to just a culminating depression.
So you feel like if he hadn't gotten shot that evening, something might have happened down the road anyway.
I feel like at that point, that evening, this country, though, was coming out of the Civil War. It was like the dawn of a new era. It was giving everybody hope that what had come before, those horrible years from 60 to 65, that we're in a new era, that we're going to move on. And Lincoln said we need to bind each other's wounds and we need to move on.
your research, did it show the relationship between Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis? How was that relationship near the end?
Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis?
Yeah.
Well, Robert E. Lee, he was the Confederate general leading the Army of Northern Virginia. There was obviously disappointment in the fact that they faced defeat, but they didn't put that blame solely on his shoulders. The Confederacy was facing huge amounts of just lack of supplies, lack of clothing, just battling the elements. Even in Gettysburg, those gentlemen being in the North, not having access to food and things of that nature, it took its toll. Sure. And there was much more recruitment of men from the Union, so they were outnumbered as well.
Right. So let's move forward. The night they go to the actual play, My American Cousin, at the Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., was there anything around that particular day that would lead you to believe something was going to happen that night?
Well, Lincoln faced several warnings that went unheeded. So people knew that there were assassination attempts, and there were others. It wasn't just Booth. There were others that were planning to assassinate Abraham Lincoln, threats that came through the Secretary of War's office. His name is Edwin Stanton. And Stanton brought those to Lincoln's attention each and every time. So Lincoln's response was, if I think about every single time that somebody threatens my life, I'll die 1,000 times instead of just,
the one time, right?
The one time.
So you can't live in fear.
That was his philosophy, and that's why he went out that night. He was facing threats, but he
said,
okay,
let's
that's
part of the game, I suppose. That's part of being president.
And he equated himself, or he often thought about the soldiers that lost their lives and the sacrifice for freedom, and felt that his sacrifice should be no less.
The play that they were watching, My American Cousin, why did they decide to go to that play that night?
Well, there's some debate on this, but the theater company that produced it was run by a woman named Laura Keene. And the production, Our American Cousin, it's a comedy. They wanted to see a comedy, not a tragedy or a drama, anything like that. So that was a good fit.
Yeah.
And it was Laura Keene's final theatrical performance in that role. And she was one of the most famous actresses of that time. So it was going to be quite an event. It was the event around Washington for that evening.
Huh. So your version, Infamous, I love the name. Tell me what we could expect to see in this, and what kind of music, and how long did it take you to write the music?
Infamous, I'm going to say what you're expecting to see is the becoming of John Wilkes Booth as the infamous one. The one who we know as the murderer of Abraham Lincoln. But the events that precipitate that, a lot of folks don't know about that. Like all these deep details that drove him to do this.
Right. Sheriff, just a few with
Well, he was secretly engaged to a woman named Lucy Hale. Her father was a Northern senator that was very close to Lincoln. So the week before, her father found out about this engagement. The father went to Abraham Lincoln as a personal request from a friend, and Lincoln made him then the ambassador to Spain. So he took his daughter away from John Wilkes Booth and broke them up, and Booth, in some regard, blamed Abraham Lincoln for that event.
Wow. It sounds like Booth had some issues of his own.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Just struggling with who he is in the world, his place in the world. Just thinking of his Confederate friends that went to fight for the Confederacy, he didn't do that. And he always felt guilty about that. He always battled that inner demon that he felt like he should fight for the Confederacy. But in fact, he didn't. So this whole story of Infamous is on his becoming who he envisioned he should be, which is misguided. But it's the story of him becoming America's infamous one.
What positive thing could you say about John Wilkes Booth?
That's a very good question, Ray. I would say that he's human. And studying all the reasons and the factors that played into this story, not justifying what he did at all, but rather understanding that he's a human being, and human beings put through certain situations are capable of doing this. And it's, a warning that just be aware of our history so we don't repeat it. We're all human.
Right.
But we need to be aware of our history so we don't repeat it.
the shot that killed him, had they had better medical attention at the time, could he have lived through that?
No, I think it was one single shot that went through the back of his head, through the back, and it rested just behind the right orbital by the eye, and that was a definite kill shot. There was nothing that could have saved him.
Did they ever recover the gun?
Yes. After Booth shot Lincoln, he dropped the gun in the box, and there was another sergeant there that was in the box with him, and he had a little fight with this sergeant in the box before he jumped to the stage.
So let's take that from the stage where he hurt his leg, and how far was the doctor from the theater?
The doctor was in the audience, in the what you would consider the front orchestra front. And when that happened, there was some confusion initially. People didn't know exactly what happened.
They heard something.
But some people thought it was from just some effect from the play. But, once Mary Lincoln actually started screaming and the sergeant from the box shouted, "Somebody stop that man," the audience actually crashed the stage in chase of John Wilkes Booth. The doctor actually got up to the stage, and they lifted him up into the box. So he didn't go up the stairs or anything. They actually lifted him from the stage to the box to treat President Lincoln.
Now, this is the same doctor that helped Booth later on?
No, this is different. This is Dr. Leal.
All right, Dr. Mudd, of course, helped John Wilkes Booth. So Booth makes it to Dr. Mudd. Barely. I don't know how I guess he stole a horse?
He had a horse in position. There was a stagehand that he had outside just holding on to the horse because, he knew he was going to make his escape. So he had him waiting with that horse in the back, and he just ran out the back of the theater, got on the horse, and it was a horse that was rented from a local stable.
So what I remember about the story is the events happening after he leaves the doctor's house.
Oh, okay.
I know a lot of strange things happen to him.
Correct.
All right, let's kind of gloss over that.
So the doctor splints his leg. There is some debate as to whether Samuel Mudd knew who John Wilkes Booth is, at that time. History goes down as saying that, yes, Samuel Mudd knew it was John Wilkes Booth that he was treating at that moment, because he tried to sell John Wilkes Booth a horse earlier in the past. So there was familiarity there. So that goes down in history. People debate that back and forth, but he knew who he was when he did it. So after that, John Wilkes Booth and David Harold, the next morning, they leave on this trek down south toward Virginia. They're trying to get to the Confederacy, but because of Booth's broken leg, it severely impacts their ability to travel, and they can only travel at night. So they end up in a Maryland swamp, where they end up in a pine thicket, and they're held up for a bunch of days. And a man named Thomas Jones brings them newspapers. That's one thing Booth craved, was hearing the reviews of what he did. He thought initially he would be hailed as a hero by the South. And Jefferson Davis even said that the death of Abraham Lincoln was one of the greatest tragedies of the Civil War.
Yeah, so he's now feeling, oh my God, what did I do?
Right. Like a moment of just complete
remorse
of I screwed up,
Yeah, but how can I make that egregious error that now has changed the course of history?
And the country that he was disillusioned with, the country he tried to do that for, has now turned his back on him.
So now, looking at the play, Infamous, how do you portray this event? How do you portray it with song? Do you have Booth actually singing in this?
Yes. So Booth is the leading character, and he has four. Well, there's a couple duets. There's 2 solo songs, one in the first act, one in the second act, but he does sing prevalently throughout. The music is a combination of period music, so from the Civil War, and there are modern elements of pop that are throughout. So you'll definitely recognize the style as musical theater, but I definitely hint at the Civil War in the music, Especially my orchestrator, he's awesome. His name's John Max McFarland. He's also from Cleveland. He chose the instrumentation for this, and he chose the instruments based upon the Civil War period instruments. So you're going to have a lot of brass, a lot of strings throughout, like a old war snare drum. You know, that comes through in the music, and it's kind of cool.
Yeah, I remember that. I think Virginia reels were very popular dances back in the day.
Right.
I remember, if I remember correctly. I'm not that old to remember it firsthand, but I did read about that. During your research and creating and writing all this, what thing was the most surprising to you, and what was the most difficult thing to get this together?
The most surprising thing to me was all of those little details that led him down the road to make the decision to finally assassinate Abraham Lincoln. I'd say the most fascinating is his secret engagement with Lucy Hale. That's something that when I saw that, I knew we had to turn this into a musical.
Yeah.
It's just a broken heart, you know. Like he did this partly out of a broken heart,
Frustration.
And frustration. Yeah.
And he was mad, and he goes, I want this woman. I can't have her. She's gone. And then I'm going to take it out on the person that did this.
And he blamed Abraham Lincoln. Now, he blamed Abraham Lincoln for many other things. You know, don't get me wrong. It wasn't just that. He was the tyrant to his people, as he would say. He equated himself as the modern Brutus.
So it seems like John Wilkes Booth was incredibly disillusioned, almost like kind of a disillusionment like Lee Harvey Oswald. Kind of like that. And that was, of course, 100 years later, but very, very strange, And now the most difficult thing in creating all these thoughts and all this information, you put it into a play with music. That had to be painstaking.
It did take a while. Actually, before I jump into that, I forgot to answer the second part of your question. The most difficult part was trying to find the humanity in John Wilkes Booth. Everybody who reads history sees this guy only in what he did, but you can't tell this story without having it resolve and showing his human side. So, in the end, I know that's a strange concept, but the fact that, and I do come at an angle where he shows remorse for what he did at the very end. And it, you think about, nobody knows what his last really thoughts were, but you gotta wonder.
So the humanity, was there any particular part of his humanity that struck you as, that you became almost empathetic?
His reflection on his action lets you feel, and his remorse for what he did, understanding who he hurt, how much he hurt him, how much he hurt the country by his action. Understanding that aspect of it lets you feel just the right amount of empathy for this villain. But he is a villain. I mean, there's no way to coat that.
You can't sugarcoat murder.
You can't sugarcoat murder, but finding the humanity in John Wilkes Booth was the most challenging part of this whole process.
You said there were 22 songs in here?
Yes.
Any one particular one just is your favorite, the one that you really say, boy, I'm so proud of this?
Absolutely. There's one that I love. It's called Springfield, and it's a duet that Abraham Lincoln and Mary Lincoln sing on the way to the theater. And, they had a chaotic relationship throughout the whole war. And at the end of this war, on the way to this date that they have has been far too long coming, they finally feel like they're getting their life back.
Okay.
And they finally get to open up to each other. And you think about that moment in that carriage ride to that theater, that that could have very well been the feelings that they were feeling on that journey. And it's a duet. It's powerful. It's sung by Maria Di Donato, who's the lead singer of Hip to That. A little bit of shout out, Cleveland band. And Abraham is played by Kevin Kelly. He's a local Cleveland director, and he's also directing the reading of Infamous at Guarino's.
And tell me a little bit about when this will actually be performed. How do people get tickets? Tell me all the particulars.
Absolutely. So the process of developing a musical, you have to go through certain developmental phases. The first one is public readings. And that's just so that the public can gauge the work and see, if people are responding the way that you want them to, the feels are there, the emotions are playing right.
The timing.
The timing is
Yes,
right.
timing.
The flow is right. So these are really important processes that we have to go through. So public readings, then you get into workshops and things. So we're in the public reading phase. So we're preparing to do public readings this summer at Guarino's. We're going to do 2 of them. And if you go to the Infamous website, it's infamousmusical.com, there'll be posted updates about when that will be. And that's going to be at Guarino's Restaurant in Little Italy off of Mayfield Road. And it'll be in the back patio. So check there for updates, but that will be upcoming this summer.
Great. Have you thought about the possibility of this getting actually picked up in New York? I mean, once hopefully the theaters will go back, and we will actually go back and be able to see a play again. Assuming that's going to happen, can you see this on Broadway?
In my mind, I see that every day, Ray.
I wanted you to say that. I wanted you to hear you say that.
It's a dream that I've had for the longest time. This project has taken 10 years now in the making.
Yeah.
But I've dreamed of writing a show ever since I was a kid.
I just think the concept of it is brilliant. I really do. And I thought about this. I go, man, nobody's ever talked about the perspective of Lincoln's assassination from John Wilkes Booth.
Thanks, Ray.
I love Lincoln. I mean, he's one of my favorite presidents, number 16. But it's just interesting to find out there had to be a lot more than, okay, he didn't like Lincoln, he shot him. I mean, there's so much more to it than that. There really is. And you always want to find out more. Of course, another conspiracy was the Kennedy assassination. Who really killed him? That's for another show. But, it would be interesting if somebody did a Lee Harvey Oswald or Jack Ruby. What's behind all that?
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. And that's part of the magic of theater is forcing you to think in different ways and challenge your mind in different ways.
Right.
It's one of the things that I love about it.
Now, is it all piano? You said you had strings, brass instruments,
Yeah, it's an 11-piece pit orchestra.
Okay.
So there's a heavy brass core. There's trumpet, trombone, tuba. There's 2 keyboards. So there's the second keyboard plays patch instruments. So like if we need to have French horn, we don't have a French horn player, but the keyboard will patch through a French horn. We have a violin, viola, cello, double bass, and a percussionist.
It's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot.
In Cleveland, where would you envision this playing?
I would love, if we're going with my dream, Ray,
Well, let's go with the dream and let's go with reality.
Okay. So, dream, definitely Playhouse Square, downtown. Would love to see it there.
Sure.
I would love to see it at local universities. Realistically, it needs to go through several workshops, which will probably be at like local community theaters in the area. Hopefully your Near West Theater, hopefully your Beck Center, places like that.
Yeah, a good place to start. Perfect it. Take it to the Palace, the State, the Ohio, one of those. Then the rights are purchased, and then the movie's made. Imagine that day. Imagine that. Infamous becomes infamous.
Let's hope so, Ray.
I hope so. One last question, David. When you were actually going through the process of this, did you ever get to the point saying, I just want to walk away, and it's you're so frustrated. Did you ever want to quit?
Yeah, there have been times that have been frustrating in the process. And, any playwright will tell you playwriting is rewriting. revising, rewriting. So, getting the story just right. I mean, something will gnaw away at you, and you don't know why. Like, this isn't working.
Yeah. Why isn't it working?
Why isn't it working? And, you just got to give yourself time. You do have to walk away from it for a little while. But you know what? Every time I walked away, maybe it was a week later, maybe it was a week and a half later, that idea came. And that was it. That was the piece that was missing.
Any particular playwrights that you look at for how did they do this? And I see how he did that. So you kind of take some of those experiences and adapt them to what you do.
Yeah, there are definitely, any musician has influences.
Sure.
My favorite composers and playwrights, I'm going to say composers. Stephen Schwartz, I'm a huge fan of Stephen Schwartz. Big fan of Frank Wildhorn. He's done Jekyll and Hyde. It's a similar kind of darkness. Frank Wildhorn does a lot of dark things like Dracula the musical, or things like Jekyll and Hyde. They're kind of dark. But Stephen Schwartz, Wicked, another example, taking what is on its face and flipping it upside down. So like, the good witch isn't who you think it is. The good,
Right.
The good witch in effect is the bad witch.
The good witch is a facade.
Right.
And behind that facade lives the evil witch.
So, I mean, that's just part of the magic of theater. And, one of my other favorites, and a lot of theater folks would agree, I'm sure, is Stephen Sondheim.
Oh, of course. Any thoughts about Andrew Lloyd Webber?
Yeah. I love Andrew Lloyd Webber's work. He's actually releasing a new musical very soon. Hopefully, once this pandemic concludes, he's going to be releasing a new version of Cinderella. And the stylings of Andrew Lloyd Webber.
Interesting. Real quick before we let you go, give us the website one more time.
Thanks, Ray. It's www.infamousmusical.com. We also have a Facebook presence, Infamous the Musical Facebook page, or infamous.themusical Instagram.
David Owen Michaels, folks. David, we're old friends, and I'm glad you stopped by to talk to me here in the Ray Carr studio. And I wish this the best of luck, and I can't wait to see it with all the performers and all the music and all the musicians ready to go.
Thank you, Ray. It's good